Hello and welcome to Infrastructure Matters, the podcast dedicated to exploring the world of public works, infrastructure and asset management. I'm your host, David Jenkins, CEO of IPWEA, and today I'm joined by Geoff Cooper, the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission. Geoff shares insights into New Zealand's new infrastructure plan, the funding challenge of maintaining assets and how systems thinking can help address climate change, housing affordability and long-term resilience. We'll dive into how Infrastructure Commission is reshaping the way projects are prioritised, why small projects and renewals matter, and what it means to plan for the next 30 years of infrastructure. So grab a coffee and join us for this insightful conversation with a leader driving the future of infrastructure in New Zealand. So welcome to the Infrastructure Matters podcast. I'm delighted to have Geoff Cooper, who's the CEO of the Infrastructure Commission based in New Zealand. And Geoff's been speaking for us today at the International Public Works Conference on a panel. It's excellent. Now, Geoff, I'm going to get straight into it. The new National Infrastructure Plan for New Zealand. Maybe you could just tell the listeners broadly just a little bit about it, how it's come about, and where you're up to.
Yeah, this was a piece of work that the existing government asked us to do through our legislation, and it's a national infrastructure plan. Is what it says on the can. It talks to about 10 different sectors in New Zealand, and it's asking a few questions. The first thing it's asking is, what as a country can New Zealand afford when it comes to infrastructure, and what might be the things that we need to see to believe we can spend more. So there's sort of like a budget affordability part to this for New Zealand. The second part really is trying to understand what the key drivers of demand are for all of our sectors. When you're thinking about, the telco or the schools or the hospitals, what are the demand drivers that are going to push up capital needs? So we're looking at things like the demographics, how fast we're growing as a country, how quick we need to decarbonize, and so on and so forth for all of these things. And so basically putting forward a view of where we would expect capital expenditure to be over a 30-year period. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of part two. And then part three to all of this, I suppose, is really spelling out for people what it means for a country to look after the existing asset base that it has. And I think this is a provocation in many ways to New Zealand to remind folks that actually the biggest challenge that we have when it comes to infrastructure actually is maintaining the service levels and all of the big asset base that we already have around us before we start thinking about building out new assets.
Do you think that message has got through to the New Zealand public about the maintenance side of things? It's not just about building new, it's looking after what you currently have.
I think it's getting there, right? I think it's a message that people believe very quickly. I would sort of say for many years, this hasn't been on the agenda, and there's but what we have seen is projects that haven't got underway, right? We've seen kind of latency when it comes to CapEx. And then alongside that, we've seen declining levels of service. So when I'm sort of out there talking about these issues with people on the ground, there's nothing new here. Like, assets need to be looked after. It's probably what we should do first. So I think it's a message that's resonating. The challenge we have really is that it's always competing against the shiny and new, isn't it? And it's very difficult to cut a ribbon on, a well-painted classroom.
What are some of the key statistics that you've been saying to the New Zealand public? Because I actually think you've created the burning platform. You've actually sold the story quite well. That you've used certain statistics, really quite key ones, to get this point across around the importance of maintenance renewal, haven't you?
Yeah, we have. And I mean, I suppose the key one we wanted to be able to say is, what does our capital budget look like? And what does the renewals component of that look like? And then we have focused the attention to the non-renewals CapEx budget. Now that is a provocation, because the renewals CapEx budget should be about 60% of the total. So for New Zealand, what that means for central government is that the non-renewals CapEx budget is in the order of 125 billion. Now, that I think has helped focus the mind, particularly for some of these big projects, right? In New Zealand, if we think about Auckland Light Rail or a second harbour crossing, these are both 20 billion plus projects. You look at that and you go, that's getting towards half of your total non-renewals CapEx budget over 30 years. That's a big bet, right? And so I think by doing that, we, you introduce a whole series of different questions about the nature of some of the problems that we face, which I think actually speaks to people's lived experience of this. That, we have a lot of needs out there, whether it's regional connectivity, whether it's decarbonisation, and it all feels like it's going quite slowly. And the reason why it's going quite slowly is because we have natural affordability handbrakes to that. And if you want to pull the trigger on a very large project, that means everything else, your schools, your hospitals, your defence estate, your courts, all of it has to go a lot slower. And there's some genuine opportunity costs there for decision makers to be thinking about.
And look, you're a national infrastructure commission, right? So, but in New Zealand, obviously, you have only two tiers of government, whereas we have three, right? Essentially, the local government's not defined in the constitution, but we have three tiers of government. So, what's the local government's role in this whole national infrastructure plan? Because they are, big asset intensive. Local government is managing many millions, sometimes billions of dollars worth of assets. How do you see local government interplaying into all this?
Yeah. So just first, a few contextual stats. The breakup, or the split up of infrastructure by New Zealand, $2 from central government, $1 from local government, $1 from private sector. So, local government does about a quarter of all of our infrastructure spend. So, big, but not the biggest, is what I would say. But what I would also say is the proportion of what they do, it looms much larger. When you think about central government, sure, they have a lot of capital assets on their books, but they're also doing other really big things like welfare policy and so on. So as a proportion of the total, and central government probably looks a little smaller, for local government, it looms very large. Now, what that means is that when there are problems in the infrastructure space, you're going to know about them sooner in local government land than you are in central government land. And that really is what's playing out in a number of different ways in New Zealand. There are sort of, broadly speaking, two different types of local governments that you could think about in New Zealand. There are the ones that are growing very fast, and in the order of 2/3 of all of our population growth over the next 30 years will go to about 5 or 6 places. So it's actually quite concentrated.
Yep.
And then on the other extreme, you have a number of local governments that are dealing with the precise opposite problem. Over the next 10 years, we expect 56 of 68 local governments to experience flat or declining population growth. And so for a lot of local government, I think the narrative has been around problems on the upside. How do we grow? How do we get capacity in place early? But of course, equally on the other side, we have local governments that are really grappling with how to simply maintain the infrastructure that they have.
Yeah, but how does the funding model work? Because I suspect it's very much like it is in Australia. The funding base is literally rates, right? So, and if we've got declining population, as you've just said, it's going to be happening some of local governments, but they've still got existing assets they need to maintain, and also they're making decisions now that means new assets are probably going to be built. This could all lead to a potential problem in the future. So how is the funding going to work between central government, local government, and to sort of manage some of these risks?
Yeah, well, I think for a long period of time, local government, has basically said this model doesn't look sustainable. And central government would like you to help us out. I mean, there's been a consistent narrative of that for many years. The issue, I think, so Ed, to your point on how it does get funded, it is majority rates. There are some user charges in there. There's development contributions and other various charges for services. But increasingly, I think that what we're learning is that these charges are not enough to fund the maintenance and grow in those areas that are growing and the growth of the of local government. And this is putting a real squeeze on. Now, what to do about this? I mean, to go back to the point around local government wanting assistance from central government, the problem that we have there is that central government is in a very difficult position as well. Central government is running structural deficits, and we are, so the Treasury says, on track without any policy changes to hit levels of debt to crown debt to GDP of 115% by 2050. Mm-hmm. So, and I would sort of add to that central government's assets are probably, I think local government assets are probably in better shape than central government. So it's not immediately obvious to me that this kind of central government, please bail us out of the problem here, is a scalable or sustainable problem in any way. At the heart of this is our ability to right-size infrastructure networks and fund them with the people that are there, right? And this really comes back to whether or not we have assets that people are prepared to pay for. Now, if you sort of look at local government, they have, over the last 100 or so years, they've gone through 3 big infrastructure booms. We've sort of written a report of this. The most recent one is from sort of the 2000s to today, but there have been two others. The boom today contrasts to the other two in one important way, and that's that revenue has not kept pace with the asset.
Yeah.
So in the past, we have built assets, local government has built assets, but they have increased their revenues alongside those assets. Probably because they were generating either rates revenue or they were generating user revenue from the asset base. What we've seen with this latest boom is that the infrastructure has been built, but the revenue has not kept pace. Now, this could happen for a variety of reasons. It might be the case that we're not getting the user charges that we should. There are proponents of things like value uplift, that we're kind of leaving chips on the table. And then there's this other sort of possibility where we are growing in a way that is actually making our balance sheet weaker, right? And what I mean by this is a simple question. When somebody comes to a new city, the city really should ask, are we getting more revenue from them than the cost of maintaining the asset to allow them to live in the city? And our work sort of demonstrates that for a fair number of New Zealand cities, they get nowhere near, right? In other words, they're growing in a way that is weakening the balance sheet of our cities. This calls into question the way that our cities are growing. Clearly, if you're doing more dispersed patterns of growth in our cities, you're going to need more infrastructure and you're going to have less funders because the density is so low. And so there is some basic financial analysis that goes in here that is actually driving a lot of these problems. We know that in New Zealand, we have for long periods of time built sort of inside-out cities. We have areas close to the city centre that have not intensified. And we have tried to solve that problem with infrastructure projects to service more distant locations, and that is very expensive. And those costs are becoming a handbrake to growth. And you see that through high house prices, you see it through high debt levels, and you see it through local governments really struggling with the idea of raising rates because at some point people will probably leave.
So so how are you going to change? How are you going to solve the problem?
Well, I think ultimately this is not just what I would say of local government, but for all asset owners, I think we need to get back to understanding what the service is that's being delivered from an asset and how many people are using that service. And for a lot of places, that will reveal assets that are not generating enough revenue or need to be cross-subsidized. Now, you can cross-subsidize, but it's not scalable, right? The most obvious sort of example, I suppose, of this is in transportation, where increasingly a lot of the funding for new transport projects is coming from outside of our hypothecated fund. So in New Zealand, we pay fuel excise duties, road user charges. It goes into a pot that then funds and maintains roads and funds new roads.
Yeah.
Increasingly, that's not enough. We're starting to go into consolidated revenues, and that's starting to compete with hospitals and schools and other such things. And so the consequence of that is possibly not having enough hospitals for an aging population. So it's really, I think, going back to the asset level and asking, where are our highest value assets and how do we make even more value out of those assets? There's a conversation right now going on in Auckland around upzoning rail stations.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great way of making better use of existing infrastructure, right? Because it's already there. We're going to have to maintain it anyway, so why not let people live next to those rail stations?
You've talked a lot about the sort of the financial analysis, right, and the money, and I want to come back to that because it's obviously related to asset management. But we are talking about, and this isn't just a New Zealand thing. We are talking about complex problems because in New Zealand, changing demographics, one driver into the whole process of infrastructure. Climate change, big thing in New Zealand. You have flooding, you have big climatic events, just like everywhere else does around the world. That's another input into the system. It's thinking differently about how we use our assets. It's another input into the system. So these are complex problems. How is Infrastructure Commission or you thinking about a sort of systems thinking approach? Because you can't just have climate change set off to one side. You can't just have people thinking about the financial analysis of infrastructure here. You can't. We've got to join the dots with this stuff. Are you beginning to think about that sort of?
Yes, is the short answer to that. I mean, what you're kind of getting at is what are our coordinating mechanisms between different asset owners and their governance structures.
You've said it far more articulately than me. That's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
And this is a challenge, right? And there are many ways of improving coordination, and I'll give you a few of them.
Great.
One example would be amalgamation, right? Auckland, the city of Auckland used to be 8 organisations or 7 local governments and a regional council. It's now 1, right? There are coordination benefits that came about as a result of that. A second one is pricing instruments. So if gate charges go up at an airport, that is a signal to the owner of the airport to think about introducing more gate space. Right, that's a coordinating mechanism between airlines and airports. And you see the same thing in energy markets, where you have quite sophisticated pricing instruments to help that coordination between generation, transmission, and distribution. What becomes obvious through that lens is that the pricing instruments, particularly in transportation, and I would say something like land use as well, are broken or non-existent. It's not like if I develop a new suburb that the National Transport Agency will generate a whole bunch more revenue from that. And so, they're not sort of looking at commercial cases for doing this. So what that means is that rather than using price instruments, you use long, lengthy planning processes to replace those pricing instruments, and that gets it can be slow and it can be frustrating, frankly. And then there's other things as well. I'm thinking about something like a requirement that New Zealand brought in recently to upzone areas of rapid transit. That is a way of forcing the coordination between planners and transport planners.
Okay, and let's stay on the sort of people side of things, because you can have all the systems, the frameworks, the policies, the coordination approach, but if you don't have people, the capacity and the capability to deliver on the ground, and and infrastructure asset managers, they sometimes they come from an engineering background, very often they don't. What's the thinking in New Zealand around building or growing capacity and capability to actually deliver on this stuff and have this focus on maintenance and renewals?
So I think for a long period of time, there's been quite a frustration that as new governments have come in with new infrastructure priorities, that it has kind of led to this stop-start approach to infrastructure projects. And at least the last sort of two significant changes in government, I think, arguably, is where this has come from. The Infrastructure Commission runs the National Infrastructure Pipeline, and there's about 9,000 projects in there. Most of them, interestingly enough, are actually very small projects. I'd say about 97% of them are probably less than 100 million. So the sort of meat and potatoes of infrastructure is not the mega projects, it is everything else. And I think actually in many ways, people don't realize that there's so many small projects on the go. Now, when I think about degrees of certainty and ability to plan for projects, The ones that appear to be most certain that you can bank on are the small ones. The small ones are executable, that they can be planned well, and they don't have such enormous cost risk to them. They're small bets. They're multiple, large scale, small bets. By contrast, the mega projects are really large bets. And as I've said before, with very high opportunity costs. And so when I sort of stand back and go, how do we get more certainty into the project pipeline so that we can build a capability around that? What sort of whacks me in the face is that you're never going to be able to get certainty on really, really big projects, enormous ones. They are, by their nature, highly uncertain. So I think where the Commission has gone is that the sort of the structural sort of groundwork of building capability has to come from projects that you can operationalize and do year in, year out, right? And that is where maintenance and renewals comes in, because you cannot avoid that stuff. And if you do avoid it, you try and avoid it for a period of time, it's just going to come back to you later in a more expensive way. And so it's very low risk I think, for decision makers and asset owners to say, you know what, like we're going to build a certain pipeline around the things that we know we're going to have to do. And it turns out there's a whole ton of those to do. So that's the sort of starting place and where the infrastructure plan at least started out.
So with the infrastructure plan, you just said you're obviously looking at the key projects. Many of them are small, etc. Some of the larger projects. Similar model to we have with Infrastructure Australia here, looking at the pipeline, right? Get it, fine, understand that. Is there a requirement though, or two things to this really? Is there a requirement on those projects that go through or are recommended by the Infrastructure Commission that there needs to be a maintenance and renewal thinking behind it after they're built? Is that part of the requirements?
It's
like
certainly
asset management plan and financial plans?
Yes. So this is exactly one of the questions that we ask when we're looking at the value for money and the deliverability part of the assessment. So the Infrastructure Priority Program is the way that the Commission provides its own independent assurance and test of readiness of a project. Yep. So we're providing a view, and that's one of the questions we ask. Where I would like to the IPP to go is for folks to be sending us asset management business cases, right? And this is something that I think we just need to see more of. I mean, so often we do business cases for new capital projects. Now I'm sitting there going, but the highest return on much of this is asset management. It's the way that we're utilizing and operating our existing assets. So where are those business cases? And why are we not seeing them being sent to us? Because I would quite like to show these against the new capital options. But I think it's something in the sector that, for whatever reason, we don't sort of go through those processes so much, or at least that those things don't bubble up. But I think that's, I would like to see a little bit more of, a comparison when you're putting these things to decision makers on where the best value for money is between these two competing objectives.
Which leads me nicely onto my last question. You've really been under a bit of a transformation change yourself with the Infrastructure Commission. You were asked by the government to come up with a 30-year strategy, key priority list around infrastructure projects. Where is the whole Infrastructure Commission going? Are you going sort of similar to Infrastructure Australia, where you're providing advisory advice around market capacity and capability, net zero decarbonising, and providing advice to government? Is this where the whole Infrastructure Commission, you see it going?
Yeah, I think that's right. The National Infrastructure Plan in many ways was actually an operational roadmap for our organisation. We have the forward guidance in there, which tells decision makers where we think levels of spend should be across all sectors within an envelope that's affordable. We will iterate that every year or two as more and better information comes into that. We will continue to run the Infrastructure Priorities Program so that I think it will take a few years to get a mature list of projects at different stages of readiness. And of course, the other thing we run, the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which is the sort of mirror up to the sector in terms of what they're planning for. We really want to continue to build that out so that New Zealanders can see what the pipeline actually is. Because for a long time, I think we actually just haven't known. There's been a call for a pipeline, and we're getting to a point now where we feel like actually we've got pretty good visibility. So those are all things I think that we will continue to iterate and operationalize, and provide advice back to government on.
Perfect. Just a sort of more of a personal question for you, Geoff. I mean, you come into the role. You've been in the role now 18 months.
But yeah, actually, just about a year now.
About a year.
Yeah.
And you come with a year. Your background's economics. What's been the biggest challenge for you to run the commission? What have you found? Sort of both some of the opportunities, but some of the things you've really had to try and get your head around. How's that sort of all played?
I mean, one of the things that I really love about the Infrastructure Commission, the subject matter is so broad, and you really have to be able to grapple with each of these sectors and bring a way of thinking that's somehow sort of replicable across all of these sectors. And I often sort of say, what is it that brings, telco, energy, transportation, and water all together, not to mention other sectors. And in some ways, it's this idea of movement, right? That we are trying to move things around New Zealand over very challenging terrain. And sometimes we're very good at that. We're very good at moving electrons around the country, and sometimes we're very bad at it, as in like congestion, which is every morning. And so I think trying to get across the details of all of those sectoral challenges and then bring them together so that you have a coordinated view and understand the interdependencies. And I would sort of make this point that our sectors have in many ways grown up in silos. They haven't had the need to sort of branch across too much, but the challenges that we face looking forward require these silos to be broken down. Climate change, adaptation challenges, housing affordability, all of this requires infrastructure systems that coordinate better with one another. And I think, these issues are exposing some of the siloed ways that our sectors have been built over generations, in fact. So having the ability and freedom to really ask systemic questions about how we can get better outcomes is something that gets me out of bed every morning.
Yeah, good on you. And what does, and I think this is probably related to your answer here, but if we were to sit down 5 years' time, we sat around this table together, I've probably got a bit more grey hair, and we say, Geoff, what does success look like for you and the Infrastructure Commission? What could you sort of put your hand on and go, this is what we've achieved and you really want to get to?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about what my sort of motivation for infrastructure is, it's about handing over an asset base to the next generation, which is in a better condition than what we found it. And sometimes that means building more infrastructure. Sometimes it means decommissioning and having difficult conversations about where we live and what assets we have, so that we're not handing over an asset with a whole pile of debt alongside it. And these questions are, because infrastructure's like lived over such a long period of time, it takes a very long horizon, I think, to pull out these issues. One of the key questions that we sort of ask is, are there enough users for this asset to see it through a renewal cycle? We get the sort of privilege of looking over such a long period of time. We can ask this question, but of course, for many people living in New Zealand or decision makers, they're not thinking 30 years in renewal cycles. So I think it's it's a bit of a privilege for the Commission to be able to ask these questions, and by doing that, I think, as I say, handing an asset base over to the next generation so that they can get the benefits that we hit.
Yeah. Geoff, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for spending time with us, talking to our members, spending time with the podcast. I think we could go on for a lot longer. I really enjoy listening to you, but thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
And that wraps up another episode of Infrastructure Matters. A big thank you to our guest, Geoff Cooper, for sharing his expertise on New Zealand's infrastructure challenges and unique opportunities. To our listeners, as always, thank you for tuning in. We hope this conversation has given you practical ideas and global perspective on balancing renewals, funding, and long-term planning. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Infrastructure Matters on your favourite podcast platform, and follow us on LinkedIn for updates and exclusive content. I'm David Jenkins, signing off, reminding you that in the realm of infrastructure, every detail matters.